Okay, so before we get into toys and chores and all the little day-to-day stuff of being a medieval kid, we gotta start at the very beginning, because honestly, just being born in medieval times was already kind of a big deal, like an actual achievement, not something anyone took for granted. There were no hospitals the way we think of them today, no doctors on call, no ultrasounds, no neat little birth plan printed out and taped to the wall. Most babies were born at home, usually with the help of a midwife, and sometimes a few other women from the community who'd gathered to help out. Men were pretty much never in the room for this. It was considered women's business, start to finish, and honestly, that was probably for the best given how things usually went. Childbirth itself was risky, genuinely risky, for both the mother and the baby. Without modern medicine, without a real understanding of infection, without any of the safety nets we rely on today, things could go wrong pretty easily, and often did. It's honestly hard for us to imagine now, but a woman going into labor in medieval times was taking a real gamble with her life every single time. And once a baby was actually born, safely, the challenges didn't stop there, not even close. Infant mortality rates were incredibly high. We're talking a huge percentage of babies not making it past their first year of life. Disease, malnutrition, complications we'd easily treat today. All of it added up to a world where losing a baby wasn't some rare tragedy. It was, unfortunately, a pretty common part of life. Almost every family experienced it at some point. Because of this, people back then had a pretty different relationship with newborns than we do now, at least in the very early days. There's actually some historical debate about this, but a lot of historians believe families sometimes held off on fully emotionally investing until a baby had survived those first risky weeks or months. Not because parents didn't love their kids, they absolutely did, but more as a kind of emotional self-protection in a world where loss was just so incredibly common. There were also a bunch of little rituals and superstitions tied to birth, because when you don't have modern medicine to explain why things happen, you tend to lean pretty heavily on tradition and a bit of hopeful magic instead. Certain charms, certain prayers, certain little practices were believed to help protect a newborn from illness or bad luck. None of it was backed by anything we'd call science today. But hey, when you're dealing with something this uncertain, you take whatever comfort you can get. Baptism was a big one here too, and this ties into how deeply religion was woven into every part of medieval life, which we've talked about before on this channel. Babies were often baptized incredibly quickly after birth, sometimes within just a day or two. Partly this was standard religious practice, sure, but there was also a real sense of urgency behind it. Given how high infant mortality was, families wanted to make sure a baby had been baptized as soon as possible, just in case. Now here's something that might surprise you. Even the name a baby was given could carry a bit of quiet, practical thinking behind it. In some families, especially if an earlier child had passed away, a new baby might actually be given that same name, which sounds a little unusual to us today, but in context, it kind of makes sense. It wasn't seen as strange or sad the way we might view it now. It was more just practical, a way of carrying a name forward within the family. Once a baby did make it through those precarious first weeks, things didn't exactly get easy, but there was at least a bit more breathing room. The first year was still a pretty fragile stretch, but every month that passed was, in a very real sense, a little victory, a little further away from the highest risk window. It's honestly kind of a lot to sit with when you think about it. This idea that simply existing, simply surviving those very first stretches of life was such an uncertain, fragile thing. We tend to think of childhood hardship in terms of chores, or lack of toys, or missing out on school. But really, for a medieval kid, the hardship started way before any of that. It started the moment they were born, into a world that offered basically zero guarantees. And yet, of course, plenty of babies did survive. Plenty grew into toddlers, then kids, then, eventually adults with their own kids someday. Resilience really was baked right into daily life back then, whether people thought about it that way or not. It kind of makes you appreciate, in a quiet way, just how much has changed. How something we consider almost completely routine today, having a healthy baby and expecting them to grow up just fine, used to be this incredibly uncertain, hopeful thing. So, if you're finding this whole deep dive into medieval life as oddly fascinating as I do, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel keep going, and drop a comment letting me know what other slice of history you'd like to drift off to next. Now, let's keep going, because once a baby actually made it past this fragile beginning, medieval society had a pretty different, and honestly kind of blurry idea of what childhood even was. Alright, so here's a question that sounds simple, but actually gets kind of interesting the more you dig into it. What even was childhood back in medieval times? Like, how did people actually think about kids? Turns out, the answer is a little more complicated than you'd expect. There's this old idea, floating around in some history books, that medieval people basically didn't recognize childhood as its own special stage of life at all. Like, the theory goes, kids were just treated as tiny, incomplete adults from basically the moment they could walk and talk, and nobody really thought much about the whole concept of childhood the way we do today. And for a while, this idea was actually pretty widely accepted. But here's the thing, a lot of historians now push back on this pretty firmly, because when you actually look at the evidence, wills, letters, court records, even little details from archaeology, like actual toys found at dig sites, it becomes pretty clear that medieval people absolutely did recognize that kids were different from adults. They just categorized that difference in a way that looks a little unfamiliar to us now. So what did that look like in practice? Well, for starters, medieval thinkers, especially those writing about education and moral development, actually did break childhood down into different stages. There was infancy, basically the baby years we just covered. Then there was something roughly translating to early childhood, up to around age 7, which was generally seen as this soft, more forgiving stage. Kids in this window weren't expected to have much self-control yet, weren't held to strict moral standards, and honestly, weren't expected to contribute a ton of serious labor either. If you enjoy relaxing history that helps you unwind or fall asleep, consider subscribing. It means a lot to my channel. Now, get comfortable and let's step back in time. Age 7, though, that's when things started shifting. This was often seen as a meaningful turning point, roughly the age when kids were considered capable of reason, capable of understanding right from wrong on a more basic level. It's actually a big deal in medieval religious thinking too, since 7 was often treated as the age a child could start taking on more religious responsibility, like understanding sin in a more serious way, or beginning to prepare for things like confession in Christian practice. So no, medieval society wasn't just tossing 5-year-olds out into the fields, expecting full adult behavior. There was real recognition that young kids needed guidance, patience, and a bit of a gentler approach. It just wasn't organized or discussed the exact same way we'd frame child development today. No pediatricians publishing milestone charts, just a general, evolving cultural understanding, shaped heavily by religious belief and practical necessity. That said, and this is important, once a kid did hit that age 7 mark, expectations really did ramp up pretty quickly. Compared to how we treat 7-year-olds today, medieval society expected a whole lot more responsibility, a whole lot faster. We're talking real chores, real contributions to the household, sometimes even the beginnings of formal training for a future trade or role. So while there was some recognition of early childhood as a distinct, gentler phase, that phase ended a lot sooner than what we'd consider normal now. Play, interestingly, still had its place, even within this more demanding framework, and we're gonna dive way deeper into medieval toys and games in a later chapter, so don't worry, we'll get there. But it's worth mentioning here that play wasn't seen as something totally separate from useful development either. A lot of medieval games and toys actually mimicked adult tasks and skills, little wooden tools, tiny replicas of household items, that sort of thing. So even fun and play often had this underlying thread of, well, this is also kind of preparing you for real life later. Class played a pretty big role here too, and this is something we'll circle back to more directly later on. A peasant child's version of childhood, however that concept was understood, looked pretty different from a noble child's version. Peasant kids were needed for labor much sooner, out of sheer economic necessity, while wealthier families had a bit more flexibility and resources to extend that gentler early phase a little longer, sometimes bringing in tutors or investing more time in structured learning before serious responsibilities kicked in. It's honestly kind of fascinating to sit with this whole idea that medieval society did see kids as, well, kids, distinct from adults, deserving some patience and gentleness in those early years, but that this recognition operated on a totally different timeline than what we're used to. 7 years old, considered ready to start taking on real responsibility and moral accountability? That's a lot to wrap your head around, especially compared to how we think about 7-year-olds today, who are, generally speaking, still very much focused on cartoons and figuring out how shoelaces work. So while it's not accurate to say medieval people had zero concept of childhood, it's also fair to say their version of childhood was shorter, more compressed, and shaped by a very different set of priorities than what we consider normal now. And that compressed timeline meant that, pretty early on, actual daily care and handling of these young kids looked a lot different too. Swaddling, feeding, who exactly was raising these babies day to day? All of that comes with its own interesting little details, which is exactly where we're headed next. So we've talked about how medieval society actually did recognize early childhood as its own little phase. Now let's get into what daily care for a newborn actually looked like, because honestly, it's pretty different from anything we'd recognize today, starting with one very specific practice: swaddling. If you're picturing swaddling, like the gentle little burrito wrap some parents do today, just to help a newborn feel snug and secure, medieval swaddling was a whole different level of intense. Babies were often wrapped tightly, and I mean tightly, with long strips of cloth, sometimes wound around the body multiple times, limbs included, arms pinned straight down at the sides. The idea was that this would help a baby's limbs grow straight, sort of like using the wrapping as a way to physically shape the body as it developed. There wasn't really science backing this up, more just tradition and belief, passed down through generations. And babies weren't just swaddled for a quick nap either. In a lot of cases, infants stayed swaddled for a huge portion of the day, sometimes even most of it, for the first several months of life, which meant a lot of medieval babies spent a good chunk of their early existence pretty immobile, unable to move their arms or legs freely, just sort of there, wrapped up like a little loaf of bread, set somewhere safe, while the adults around them got on with the demanding business of daily medieval survival. This actually connects to something we should talk about, honestly, given everything we've covered about how physically demanding a medieval day was. The fire, the water hauling, the fieldwork. Parents, especially mothers, generally didn't have the luxury of constantly holding or attending to a baby throughout the day, so swaddling served a pretty practical purpose here too. A tightly wrapped baby could be safely set down, maybe in a basic cradle, sometimes even hung in a sling-like contraption, while the parent got on with essential chores. Now, wealthier families had a pretty different setup here, and this is where wet nurses come into the picture. If a noble or wealthy merchant family could afford it, it was actually pretty common to hire a wet nurse, a woman who would breastfeed and often care for the baby in place of the biological mother. This freed up noble mothers to return to their usual social and household responsibilities much sooner after giving birth, rather than being tied down with the demanding, constant work of caring for a newborn themselves. Wet nurses often lived with the family, or sometimes the baby was actually sent to live with the wet nurse's own household for a period of time, which sounds like a pretty big deal to us today, but was considered a fairly normal practice among wealthier medieval families. This meant that for some noble babies, their earliest bond and closest daily care actually came from someone other than their biological mother, which is a pretty interesting little wrinkle in how we think about early parent-child attachment. For peasant families, though, wet nurses obviously weren't really an option financially. Mothers breastfed their own babies, when possible, though this came with its own complications, given how demanding daily peasant labor already was. Balancing feeding a newborn with everything else we've covered throughout this whole video, the fire, the water, the fields, meant mothers were juggling an incredible amount, often bringing babies along, in some capacity, to wherever the day's work was happening, rather than having the option to simply stay home and focus solely on childcare. Cradles themselves were pretty basic, usually simple wooden constructions, sometimes with rockers built in to help soothe a fussy baby. Nothing fancy, nothing padded the way we'd expect today, but functional enough to keep a swaddled baby safely contained while the rest of the household carried on with its endless list of daily tasks. There's something worth sitting with here, in terms of how different this whole approach feels compared to modern parenting philosophy, which tends to emphasize a lot of physical closeness, skin-to-skin contact, constant responsiveness to a baby's needs. Medieval infant care, by comparison, feels a lot more practical, almost utilitarian in places, shaped heavily by the sheer physical demands of daily survival rather than by any particular parenting theory. It wasn't that parents didn't love their babies, of course they did, but the luxury of constant, attentive childcare simply wasn't realistic for most families, given everything else that needed to get done just to keep the household functioning. It's honestly a pretty gentle reminder of just how much modern life has changed our relationship with early parenting. The tight swaddling, the practical use of wet nurses among the wealthy, babies being set aside safely, while parents tackled an endless list of physical labor. All of it paints a picture of infancy that was safe enough, structured enough, but definitely not built around the kind of constant closeness we tend to associate with early childhood today. And once a baby did start growing, once those wrapped-up limbs finally got some freedom, and a toddler started taking their first wobbly steps, a whole new set of challenges was waiting, because a medieval household, as we've established pretty thoroughly by now, was not exactly what we'd call toddler-proofed. All right, so our little swaddled bundle has finally broken free. Arms and legs are loose, mobility is happening, and the toddler years have officially begun. And look, toddlers are a handful in any era. That's just kind of a universal truth about small humans learning to move around on their own for the first time. But a medieval household added a whole extra layer of genuine hazard to this already wobbly, unpredictable stage of life. Let's start with the fire, since we've talked about it so much already in this series, and for good reason. It was central to literally everything. That same hearth that provided heat, light, and cooking capability was sitting right there, low to the ground, completely open, in the middle of the main living space. Now picture a toddler, freshly mobile, curious about literally everything, moving around a home with an open flame, at exactly their height and exactly their curiosity level. Not exactly a reassuring combination. There weren't safety gates. There weren't outlet covers, obviously, since there was no electricity to worry about, but the equivalent hazards were everywhere else instead. Sharp tools left within reach, since most households didn't have the luxury of a separate, toddler-free storage space. Animals wandering in and out, sometimes larger animals that could easily knock over or injure a small child without any real intention of harm, just through sheer size and unpredictability. And here's a big one: water. We've already covered how essential water hauling was to daily life. Buckets, basins, sometimes larger open containers kept around the house. For an adult, these are just practical household items. For a toddler, an open bucket of water actually represents a genuine drowning risk, something that's honestly still true today, which is why modern parents are warned about this exact hazard. But in a medieval home, without the kind of constant supervision modern parenting emphasizes, this risk was just sort of baked into daily life, an accepted, quiet danger that existed alongside everything else. Outdoor spaces came with their own set of hazards too. Wells, streams, and ponds, all the water sources we've talked about throughout this whole video, were also, unfortunately, potential dangers for a wandering toddler who didn't yet understand the concept of danger at all. Farmyards had their own risks as well: uneven ground, tools left lying around, larger livestock that could unintentionally cause serious injury. Given all of this, it probably won't surprise you that toddler mortality rates were, unfortunately, quite high throughout the medieval period. This particular age range, once a baby became a mobile, curious toddler, but before they were old enough to really understand and avoid danger, represented one of the more vulnerable stretches of childhood. Accidents, alongside disease, which we'll dive into more in a later chapter, contributed heavily to the difficult reality that a lot of children simply didn't make it to their 5th birthday, let alone their 10th. So how did families actually handle this, practically speaking, given how demanding daily labor already was? Well, supervision was often a shared, somewhat loose responsibility, rather than the intense, one-on-one attention we associate with modern toddler parenting. Older siblings frequently played a role here, even siblings who were still pretty young themselves, sometimes tasked with keeping an eye on a toddler while parents tackled essential chores. We're actually going to talk more about this specific dynamic, kids helping raise other kids, in our next chapter, since it connects directly to how early medieval children were expected to start contributing. Extended family and community also played a role in this loose supervision network. In smaller villages, where everyone generally knew everyone else, there was a bit more of a communal watchfulness over wandering children, neighbors keeping half an eye out, that sort of thing. It wasn't a formal system by any means, more just a natural byproduct of tight-knit community living. There's also something worth mentioning about the physical layout of these homes and farms, which, honestly, didn't offer a ton of accommodation for toddler safety specifically. Doorways were often just open, without any kind of barrier. Yards blended pretty seamlessly into farmland or open paths, without fencing designed to contain a small child. The entire physical environment simply wasn't designed with toddler safety as any kind of priority, mainly because that concept, toddler-proofing a living space, just didn't really exist yet as an idea. It's a genuinely sobering thing to think about, honestly. This particular stretch of childhood, the wobbly, curious, not yet careful toddler years, carried real, tangible risk in a way that's hard for us to fully relate to today. Living in homes specifically designed with child safety in mind, with constant access to emergency medical care if something does go wrong. And yet, plenty of toddlers did make it through this precarious stage, growing steadily more capable, more aware of their surroundings, more able to understand basic warnings and dangers. And as soon as that happened, as soon as a child showed even a little bit of reliable capability, medieval households wasted absolutely no time putting that capability to good use, because contributing to the household, even in small ways, started a whole lot earlier than most of us would probably expect. All right, so our toddler has survived the wobbly, danger-filled early years, and is now a slightly steadier, slightly more aware little kid. And here's where medieval childhood takes a turn that might genuinely surprise you, because pretty much as soon as a child showed any real capability at all, they were expected to start helping out. And we're not talking about age 7 or 8 here. We're talking shockingly young, like before age 5 young. Now, before you picture toddlers being sent out to plow fields, let's be clear. The tasks given to really young kids were, understandably, pretty simple and low stakes. Nobody was handing a 4-year-old a scythe, but even simple tasks represented a level of expected responsibility that looks pretty different from how we think about early childhood today, where the biggest job a 4-year-old usually has is maybe putting their own toys away, and even that's often a struggle. So what did these little tasks actually look like? Well, one of the earliest and most common jobs given to young children was basic watching duties. And this connects directly to something we touched on last chapter: older siblings helping supervise younger ones. Even a child who was maybe 4 or 5 years old themselves might be given the responsibility of keeping an eye on an even younger sibling, a baby or toddler, while a parent focused on more demanding chores, which again sounds like a lot to ask of a small child by today's standards, but was just considered normal, practical delegation of labor within a household where every single set of hands mattered. Beyond childcare, young kids were often given small, simple household tasks too: fetching small items, helping tidy up basic messes. If the family kept chickens, a young child might be tasked with helping scatter feed or gathering eggs, simple jobs that didn't require much strength or skill, but still contributed something genuinely useful to the household's daily functioning. Farm life offered plenty of these small-scale opportunities too. Young kids might help with things like scaring birds away from crops, a job that sounds almost fun in a weird way, running around, making noise, being generally a nuisance to birds, except it was actually a genuinely important task for protecting a family's food supply. Kids might also help with very basic sorting tasks, separating good produce from bad, or helping collect small items like fallen fruit or nuts. Here's an interesting little detail: a lot of these early tasks weren't really framed as chores in the way we might think of them: boring, obligatory, something to complain about. Because play and work weren't always clearly separated for young kids in medieval households. Remember back in Chapter 2, when we talked about how a lot of medieval toys actually mimicked real household tasks? This connects directly to that idea. A young child helping gather eggs, or helping with small farm tasks, might genuinely experience this as a form of play, a way of feeling useful, a way of imitating and connecting with the adults around them, rather than viewing it purely as tedious labor. That said, and this is important to acknowledge honestly, this early introduction to responsibility also reflected a household's genuine economic necessity, not just some gentle natural process of learning through play. Families, especially peasant families, needed every available bit of help they could get. There wasn't a lot of room for a purely carefree, responsibility-free early childhood, simply because the practical demands of daily survival didn't really allow for it. Learning through observation and imitation played a huge role here too, since formal schooling, which we'll dive into more in our next chapter, wasn't accessible to most peasant children. A lot of early learning happened simply by watching, and then attempting to copy, the adults around them. A young child watching their mother cook, or watching their father tend animals, would naturally start picking up small skills and habits through this constant, informal observation, long before they were ever given any kind of formal instruction. This approach to early childhood, gradually easing kids into responsibility through small, manageable tasks, actually served a pretty practical developmental purpose too, even if nobody back then would have framed it in those exact terms. By the time a child reached that more significant age 7 milestone we talked about earlier, the point where expectations really ramped up substantially, they'd already had several years of gradually building experience, capability, and familiarity with the rhythms of daily household work. It wasn't some sudden, jarring transition into serious responsibility. It was more of a slow, steady ramp up, built on top of small contributions that started incredibly early. It's honestly a pretty interesting contrast to sit with. When you think about how differently we approach early childhood today, where the emphasis is so heavily placed on play, exploration, and delaying real responsibility for as long as possible. Medieval childhood, by comparison, treated even very young kids as capable, contributing members of the household, albeit in small, age-appropriate ways. And once a child had built up some of these early skills and habits through simple helping tasks, there was actually a whole world of genuine play waiting for them too. Because despite everything we've covered about responsibility and hardship, medieval kids absolutely still found ways to have fun. And what they actually played with is honestly pretty fascinating. Okay, finally, a slightly lighter chapter. Because despite everything we've covered so far, the hardship, the responsibility, the genuinely difficult odds, just of surviving early childhood, medieval kids still found ways to just be kids. They played, they had fun, and honestly, some of what they played with is pretty charming once you get into the details. Let's start with dolls, since these show up pretty consistently across archaeological finds and historical records. Medieval dolls weren't the polished, detailed toys we might picture today. They were often simple, handmade things, sometimes crafted from wood, sometimes from cloth, stuffed with rags or straw. Wealthier families might have slightly more elaborate versions, maybe with painted faces or nicer fabric, but the basic concept remained pretty consistent across social classes. A simple, humble little figure, good enough to spark a kid's imagination, which honestly is really all a doll needs to do anyway. Then there's Knucklebones, which is a genuinely fascinating one, because it's exactly what it sounds like. Kids played games using actual small animal bones, usually from sheep or goats, tossing and catching them in various patterns, kind of similar in spirit to modern jacks. If you're familiar with that game, it sounds a little unusual to modern ears, using literal bones as toys, but bones were readily available, essentially free, and durable enough to handle a lot of enthusiastic childhood play. Practical, resourceful, and honestly kind of clever when you think about it. Hoops were another popular item, simple wooden circles that kids would roll along the ground, guiding them with a stick, trying to keep them upright, and moving for as long as possible. This is one of those toys that's honestly stuck around in various forms across a huge stretch of human history, showing up in different eras and cultures, probably because it's just genuinely fun and requires almost nothing to make. Balls, too, existed in various forms, though obviously nothing like the manufactured, perfectly round balls we're used to today. Medieval balls might be made from stitched leather stuffed with something soft, or sometimes even inflated animal bladders, which honestly sounds a little questionable by modern standards. But hey, it worked well enough for a good game of catch, or an early, informal version of ball games that would eventually evolve into things resembling early sports. Speaking of which, let's talk about physical games more broadly, because a lot of medieval childhood play didn't involve toys at all, just imagination, physical energy, and whatever open space happened to be available. Simple chasing games, early versions of tag, wrestling matches between kids, testing their strength against each other. These kinds of unstructured physical games were probably a huge part of daily play, especially since formal, structured entertainment just wasn't really a concept yet for most families. Here's something worth mentioning, connecting back to what we talked about last chapter. A lot of children's play actually mimicked adult activities and roles, which makes a lot of sense when you think about how heavily observation and imitation shaped early learning. Kids might play at farming, using small sticks as makeshift tools, imitating the exact tasks they watched their parents doing every day. Girls might play with small household items, practicing domestic tasks in a playful, low-stakes way. This kind of imaginative role play wasn't just entertainment, it was also, in a subtle way, informal practice for skills they genuinely need later on. Music and storytelling deserve a mention here too, even though they're not exactly toys in the traditional sense. Simple instruments, things like basic whistles or small drums, sometimes homemade, gave kids a chance to make noise and have fun in a slightly different way. And storytelling, oral tradition, passed down through parents, grandparents, and community elders, provided entertainment too, especially during long winter evenings when outdoor play wasn't really an option. We're actually going to circle back to storytelling specifically later in this video, since it played such a genuinely meaningful role in medieval childhood. Seasonal and outdoor elements played into play too, in ways that feel pretty timeless honestly. Kids climbing trees, kids playing in streams during warmer months, kids building little forts or hideouts, using whatever natural materials happened to be lying around. A lot of this kind of play required zero manufactured toys at all, just open space, a bit of imagination, and the general energy that seems to be baked into childhood, regardless of what era you happen to be born into. It's honestly kind of comforting, in a way, to sit with this chapter after everything else we've covered. Because despite all the genuine hardship, the labor, the danger, the difficult odds of survival, kids still played. They still found joy in simple, resourceful little games and toys. And that particular thread of human childhood, finding fun wherever you can, with whatever's available, feels pretty universal across basically every era of history. Of course, play wasn't the only thing filling up a medieval kid's day, and once we get past this lighter chapter, we're heading into something a little more structured, because while play might have come naturally, learning, actual education, was a whole different story for most medieval children, and access to it depended heavily on circumstances completely outside a kid's control. All right, let's talk about education. And here's the short version, before we get into the details. If you were a medieval kid, especially a peasant kid, chances are pretty high you never set foot in anything resembling a formal school. No classrooms, no desks lined up in neat rows, no homework, which, okay, might sound kind of nice at first, but honestly, the reality behind why school wasn't available says a lot about how limited access to education actually was back then. Let's start with literacy rates, because this really sets the stage for everything else in this chapter. For most of the medieval period, the vast majority of the general population, especially peasants, could not read or write. We're talking a genuinely small percentage of people having any real literacy at all, mostly concentrated among clergy, nobility, and certain merchant families who needed those skills for business purposes. For everyone else, reading and writing just weren't considered necessary, practical skills for daily survival. So if formal reading and writing education wasn't happening for most kids, how did they actually learn anything? Well, this is where oral tradition and hands-on, practical learning came in. And honestly, this system, while completely different from what we're used to today, was actually pretty effective at teaching kids exactly what they needed to know to survive and contribute within their specific community. We touched on this a little in earlier chapters, but it's worth diving deeper here. A huge amount of medieval learning happened through direct observation and imitation. A young child watching their parents work, gradually picking up small tasks, slowly building toward more complex skills over years of consistent, hands-on exposure. This wasn't structured the way formal education is today. No set curriculum, no specific lessons planned out in advance. It was more organic, more built into the natural rhythm of daily life, learning by simply being present and gradually taking on more responsibility. Storytelling played a genuinely important educational role here too, and this connects back to what we mentioned briefly last chapter. Oral tradition wasn't just entertainment, it was actually a meaningful way of passing down important information, moral lessons, practical knowledge, and cultural values from one generation to the next. Parents, grandparents, and community elders would share stories, sometimes religious in nature, sometimes more practical, like stories about local history or seasonal farming knowledge, and kids absorbed a genuine education through these narratives, even without ever picking up a book. Now, for those relatively few kids who did have access to formal education, this was usually tied pretty directly to either wealth or religious path. Monasteries and church schools were actually some of the earliest, most consistent providers of formal education throughout medieval Europe. Boys being trained for religious life, whether that meant becoming a monk, a priest, or working within the church in some capacity, would receive genuine instruction in reading, writing, usually in Latin, plus religious study, and sometimes broader academic subjects, depending on the specific institution. This educational path, though, was pretty exclusively available to boys, and we're going to dive a lot deeper into this whole gender divide in our next chapter, since it shaped basically every aspect of a medieval kid's upbringing, education very much included. But it's worth planting that seed here. Formal schooling, when it existed at all, was overwhelmingly geared toward boys, particularly boys from families with either the wealth or the religious connections to make that kind of education accessible. Wealthy, noble families sometimes brought in private tutors too, another path to formal education completely separate from peasant experience. A tutor might live within the household, providing lessons not just in reading and writing, but also things like basic mathematics, foreign languages, and subjects considered appropriate for someone who might eventually manage an estate, handle business dealings, or navigate complex social and political relationships as an adult. Trade skills represent another really important form of education we should mention here. Even though it doesn't look anything like classroom-based learning, we're actually going to dedicate a whole chapter later on specifically to apprenticeships, since that system represented such a significant educational path for a lot of medieval kids, particularly as they got a bit older. But it's worth noting here that learning a trade, whether that meant farming techniques, craftsmanship, or eventually a formal apprenticeship in something like blacksmithing or carpentry, absolutely counted as legitimate, valuable education, even without a single book involved. So when you step back and look at the full picture, it becomes pretty clear that education in medieval times looked way different depending purely on circumstances of birth. A peasant child would receive a genuinely rich education in practical survival skills, farming knowledge, household management, oral tradition, and moral instruction, just without ever formally learning to read. Meanwhile, a small percentage of kids, mostly boys, mostly from wealthy or religiously connected families, had access to formal literacy-based education that opened up completely different opportunities later in life. It's honestly a pretty striking reminder of how much access and opportunity shaped a medieval kid's entire trajectory, often based purely on circumstances they had zero control over. And speaking of shaping influence, religion, which we've touched on throughout this whole video already, actually played an even bigger, more direct role in a medieval child's daily life and moral education than we've covered so far, which is exactly where we're headed next. All right, so we've mentioned religion quite a bit throughout this whole video already. It's honestly kind of impossible not to, given just how deeply woven faith was into basically every aspect of medieval life. But let's slow down here and really focus on this specifically, because for a medieval child, the church wasn't just some occasional Sunday thing. It was present consistently from literally the first few days of life, shaping identity, moral understanding, and daily routine in a really significant way. We already touched on baptism back in our very first chapter. Remember, that quick, urgent ritual that usually happened within just a day or two of birth. This wasn't just a nice ceremony. Within medieval Christian belief, baptism was considered essential, a genuinely important spiritual milestone that marked a baby's official entry into the church community. So right from the very start, Before a child could even hold their head up on their own, their identity was already deeply tied to their faith and their place within the church. As kids grew a little older, religious instruction became a pretty consistent part of daily upbringing, though not in the formal, classroom-based way we might picture today. Remember our whole conversation about oral tradition and learning through observation? Religious teaching followed that same basic pattern. Parents would teach their children basic prayers, simple religious concepts, and moral lessons through repetition and daily practice, rather than through any kind of structured lesson plan. The Lord's Prayer and the Hail Mary were probably some of the earliest, most consistently taught prayers, things kids would learn to recite from a pretty young age, likely well before they could actually understand the deeper meaning behind the words. This is honestly a pretty relatable concept, if you think about it. Kids memorizing something through repetition, long before genuinely grasping what it means, kind of like how little kids today might sing along to a song without fully understanding all the lyrics. Remember that age 7 milestone we talked about back in chapter 2? This comes back into play here in a pretty significant way. Age 7 was generally considered the point where a child reached what was called the age of reason, meaning they were now considered capable of understanding right from wrong on a deeper, more serious level. This had genuine religious implications too, since it was often around this age that children would begin preparing for their first confession, taking on a level of moral accountability within their faith that younger kids simply weren't expected to handle yet. This shift ties back pretty directly to something we discussed earlier too, that broader jump in general responsibility and expectation that happened around the same age. Religious accountability and practical, daily life responsibility kind of increase together, reinforcing each other, creating this sense that around age 7, a child was genuinely transitioning into a more serious, more accountable phase of life, spiritually and practically both. Village life made regular church attendance a pretty natural, built-in part of a child's weekly, and honestly often daily, routine too. Remember how we talked about church bells structuring the whole rhythm of daily life? Kids grew up constantly surrounded by these religious rhythms. The sound of bells, marking different points of the day, regular attendance at Mass, religious festivals and feast days breaking up the calendar throughout the year. Faith wasn't something separate from daily life that you engaged with occasionally. It was baked directly into the background rhythm of basically every single day. Moral instruction extended well beyond just formal prayers too. A lot of the storytelling tradition we discussed in earlier chapters carried heavy religious undertones, stories designed specifically to teach lessons about honesty, kindness, humility, and consequences for bad behavior, often using religious framing and examples to reinforce these broader moral concepts. So even entertainment, even the stories shared around a fire on a long winter evening, frequently carried this underlying thread of religious and moral teaching. For those relatively few kids who did end up pursuing a religious education path, whether through monastery schooling or training to eventually become clergy themselves, religion obviously played an even more direct, formal role in their daily upbringing. We touched on this a bit in our last chapter regarding formal education access. But even for regular kids, kids who'd never set foot in a formal religious institution, beyond their local village church, faith still shaped their daily understanding of the world in a genuinely significant, consistent way. It's worth acknowledging, too, that this heavy religious framing wasn't just about individual spiritual belief. It also reinforced broader social order and expectations, teaching kids obedience, respect for authority, and acceptance of their place within a pretty rigid social hierarchy, which, honestly, connects pretty directly to some of what we're going to discuss in our next chapter, because that hierarchy, that whole system of expectation and social role, actually started splitting kids onto pretty different paths based on one specific factor, and that factor was simply whether a child happened to be born a boy or a girl. Alright, so we've been talking this whole video about medieval childhood pretty broadly, but here's the thing. That experience actually split pretty significantly, depending on one simple factor, whether a child was born a boy or a girl. And this split started way earlier and went way deeper than you might expect. Let's start right from birth, honestly, because even in those very first days, this divide was already quietly shaping things. In a lot of medieval families, particularly among nobility where inheritance and family lineage carried serious weight, the birth of a son was often greeted with a bit more open celebration than the birth of a daughter. This wasn't universal, and plenty of families genuinely welcomed daughters with real joy too. But there was a broader cultural preference at play, tied heavily to inheritance systems, family name continuation, and the general social value placed on male heirs. Now, once we move past infancy into those toddler and early childhood years we've already covered, boys and girls actually experienced fairly similar treatment at first. Remember all those little helper tasks we talked about back in Chapter 5? In the earliest years, both boys and girls were given similarly simple, low-stakes responsibilities. But as kids got a bit older, usually somewhere around that significant age 7 milestone we keep coming back to, this is where paths really started diverging in a noticeable way. For girls, this divergence generally meant a shift toward domestic training. Girls would start learning household skills in a much more focused, consistent way. Things like cooking, sewing, spinning wool into thread, basic weaving, and general household management. This wasn't seen as optional or supplementary either. These skills were considered absolutely essential, since a girl's future value within her family and eventual future household was heavily tied to her domestic capability. Marriage was pretty much the expected path for the vast majority of medieval girls, so this training was directly preparing them for that eventual role as a wife and household manager. Boys, meanwhile, generally shifted toward more physically demanding, outdoor-focused training. For peasant boys, this meant more intensive involvement in actual farm labor, learning to work alongside fathers and older male relatives in the fields, with animals, and with basic tool use and maintenance. The physical strength and endurance we talked about back in our earlier chapters on fieldwork, that kind of training and conditioning really started ramping up, specifically for boys around this age. Here's something worth mentioning, connecting back to our chapter on education. Remember how we talked about formal schooling being overwhelmingly geared toward boys? This ties in directly here too. If a family had any opportunity at all for a child to receive formal education, whether through church schooling or private tutoring for wealthier families, that opportunity was almost always directed towards sons rather than daughters. Girls, even from relatively well-off families, generally received a lot less formal, literacy-based education compared to their brothers, since reading and writing simply weren't considered as directly relevant to their expected future role. That said, it's worth noting this wasn't universally true across every single family or region. Some wealthier families did provide daughters with a degree of education too, sometimes including basic literacy, needlework instruction, that included reading religious texts, or other skills considered appropriate for managing a household or eventually running an estate. But generally speaking, when resources and opportunity were limited, which they usually were, priority consistently went towards sons. Physical expectations diverged pretty noticeably too. Boys were generally given more freedom to roam, to engage in rougher physical play, and eventually to take on more physically demanding labor. Girls, meanwhile, were often kept closer to home, both for practical reasons, since domestic training happened primarily within the household, and also due to broader social expectations around modesty and appropriate behavior for girls and young women. Marriage age itself reflects this whole divergent path pretty clearly too. Girls, particularly among nobility, were sometimes betrothed or even formally married at a genuinely young age by modern standards, sometimes not long after childhood itself, though actual cohabitation and consummation of these marriages was generally delayed until a more physically mature age. Boys, generally speaking, married a bit later, often once they'd established enough skill or trade capability to actually support a household. It's honestly pretty striking, when you step back and look at the full picture, just how early and how thoroughly this gender-based divide shaped basically every aspect of a medieval kid's upbringing. Education, daily tasks, physical freedom, future expectations, all of it split pretty dramatically, based purely on whether a child happened to be born a boy or a girl, a factor obviously completely outside anyone's control. And this divide actually carries forward pretty directly into our next chapter too, because this whole pattern of training and preparation eventually led somewhere pretty significant for a lot of medieval kids: apprenticeships, and the surprisingly young age many children were sent off to train, and sometimes even live, with families other than their own. Alright, so we've spent this whole video building up to this moment, gradually watching medieval kids take on more and more responsibility as they got older, and now we've reached one of the more significant transitions in a medieval child's life: apprenticeships. Because for a lot of kids, especially as they moved into their preteen years, this meant something pretty big: actually leaving home. Let's talk about the age first, because this genuinely surprises a lot of people. Apprenticeships often began somewhere around age 7 to 10, sometimes even a bit younger, depending on the specific trade and family circumstances. Which means, for a lot of medieval kids, right around the exact age we're covering in this whole video, they weren't just taking on more chores at home, they were potentially being sent away entirely to live and train with a completely different family. Now, this wasn't quite as harsh or abrupt as it might sound at first. Apprenticeship was a genuinely structured system, usually involving a formal agreement between a child's parents and the master craftsman or tradesperson who'd be taking them on. This agreement typically outlined things like the length of the apprenticeship, which could often run anywhere from 5 to 7 years, sometimes even longer, plus expectations around what skills would be taught and what basic care the apprentice would receive in return. So what did this actually look like day to day? A young apprentice would essentially move into their master's household, becoming part of that family's daily life while learning a specific trade. This could be almost anything, depending on where a family lived and what connections they had: blacksmithing, carpentry, tailoring, baking, leatherworking. The specific trade options varied pretty widely, but the basic structure remained fairly consistent across different crafts. In exchange for this training, an apprentice was expected to work, genuinely work, contributing labor to their master's business, often doing the most basic, entry-level tasks at first: sweeping, fetching materials, handling simple preparatory work, before gradually being trusted with more skilled, hands-on aspects of the actual trade as they got older and more experienced. This whole system meant that a lot of medieval kids experienced something pretty significant that we haven't really touched on yet in this video: actual separation from their biological family, sometimes for years at a stretch. Given how physically demanding and dangerous travel could be, plus the general slower pace of medieval communication, a kid sent off to apprentice in even a moderately distant town might not see their family again for a genuinely long time, sometimes not until the entire apprenticeship period had concluded. It's honestly worth pausing here to think about what that emotional experience might have actually been like for a young child, leaving home, leaving parents and siblings, moving in with essentially strangers, and being expected to work hard and learn quickly. all at an age that we'd today consider way too young for that kind of independence and responsibility. That said, this was such a normalized, expected part of medieval life that it likely didn't carry the same emotional weight or novelty that it would for a modern kid experiencing something similar. It was simply how things worked, a widely understood and accepted path toward eventually becoming a skilled, independent adult with a genuine trade and livelihood. Not every kid ended up in a formal, structured apprenticeship like this, of course. Plenty of peasant children, especially those whose families needed their labor directly on the family farm, simply continued that gradual increase in agricultural responsibility we've talked about throughout this whole video, rather than being sent elsewhere to learn a specific trade. Apprenticeships were more common in towns and among families with specific trade connections or aspirations for their children to move into skilled craftsmanship rather than farming. Girls, interestingly, could sometimes be apprenticed too, though this was less common than for boys, and the trades available to them were generally more limited, often things like specific textile work, or occasionally being placed into domestic service within a wealthier household, learning household management skills in a more formalized, live-in setting rather than staying within their own family home. There's also an important distinction worth making here between formal, skilled apprenticeship and simply being sent into domestic service or basic labor for another household, which was also a genuinely common path, especially for kids from poorer families. This didn't necessarily involve learning a specific skilled trade the way formal apprenticeship did, but it followed a similar basic pattern. A young child leaving their family home to live and work within someone else's household, often in exchange for basic room, board, and sometimes a small wage. By the time all of this is considered, it becomes pretty clear that this specific age range we're covering in this whole video, that stretch before turning 10, actually represented a genuinely significant crossroads for a lot of medieval kids. Some stayed close to home, gradually taking on more agricultural or domestic responsibility. Others were sent away entirely, beginning a formal path toward a skilled trade, often years before they'd even reach what we'd consider the start of adolescence today. Of course, this whole pattern looked pretty different once again for kids born into wealth and nobility, since apprenticeship in a trade simply wasn't part of their expected path at all. Their version of preparing for adulthood involved a completely different set of priorities, tutors, courtly manners, and an entirely different vision of what their future role in society would eventually look like. All right, so we just spent a whole chapter talking about apprenticeships, kids being sent away, learning trades, taking on serious labor from a genuinely young age. But if you were born into a noble family, none of that really applied to you. Your path looked completely different, shaped by a totally separate set of priorities and expectations. Let's start with the basics here, because we've actually touched on some of this throughout the video already. Remember back in our chapter on infant care, where we talked about wet nurses? That pattern of outsourcing certain aspects of early childhood care continued in various forms throughout a noble child's upbringing, just in different, evolving ways as they got older. Once a noble child moved past those earliest infant years, education became a genuinely significant focus, way more structured and consistent than what most peasant kids ever experienced. We touched on private tutors back in our education chapter, but let's dig into this a bit more. A noble family with the resources to do so would often bring in a dedicated tutor, sometimes multiple tutors handling different subjects, to provide their children with a genuinely comprehensive education right within the household. This education typically included reading and writing, usually in Latin, as well as the local vernacular language. Since Latin remained the language of scholarship, law, and the church throughout most of the medieval period, basic mathematics was often included too, particularly important for children who'd eventually need to manage estate finances or understand business and trade dealings as adults. But noble education went well beyond just academic subjects. there was also this whole other layer of training focused on manners, social conduct, and what we might broadly call courtly behavior. Because for a noble child, success in adulthood wasn't just about knowledge, it was also heavily tied to how well you could navigate complex social and political relationships, how properly you carried yourself in formal settings, and how well you understood the intricate web of social hierarchy and etiquette that govern noble life. This meant noble kids were often taught things like proper table manners, appropriate ways to address people of different social ranks, basic dancing, and social conversation skills, all considered genuinely essential parts of their upbringing, just as important, in their world, as reading or arithmetic. For noble boys specifically, this education often included preparation for eventual military or political leadership roles too. Depending on the family and the specific era, this might involve early training in horsemanship, and eventually, as they got a bit older, basic combat skills and weapons training, preparing them for a potential future role, defending family lands, or serving in some kind of military capacity. Some noble boys, particularly younger sons, who wouldn't inherit the main family title or estate, were sometimes sent to serve as pages in another noble household, a system that's honestly got some interesting parallels to that whole apprenticeship structure we just talked about, just adapted for a completely different social class and set of skills. As a page, a young noble boy would live within another noble household, learning courtly manners, basic military training, and general preparation for eventual knighthood, sometimes eventually progressing to the role of squire as they got a bit older, before potentially becoming a knight themselves as a young adult. So interestingly, noble families also sometimes sent their children away from home for training, just in a completely different context, and toward a completely different eventual goal. Compared to peasant apprenticeship for noble girls, education looked different again, generally focusing more heavily on skills considered appropriate for eventually managing a noble household, and for the social responsibilities that came with noble marriage. This might include more advanced needlework and textile skills compared to what a peasant girl would learn, basic literacy in some cases, religious education, music, and social graces considered important for noble social life, things like conversation skills, and basic etiquette for formal gatherings and courtly events. Marriage, as we touched on briefly in our last chapter, often loomed pretty large for noble children too, sometimes from a genuinely young age. Noble marriages were frequently arranged for political or economic reasons, sometimes negotiated and formally agreed upon, while children were still quite young, even if actual marriage and cohabitation was delayed until they were older. This meant a noble childhood often came with this underlying awareness that your future path, your eventual spouse, your role within a broader political and social framework had already been decided by your family, long before you had any real say in the matter yourself. It's worth acknowledging here, too, that noble childhood, despite all these material advantages, comfortable living conditions, access to education, freedom from intense physical labor, still came with its own genuine pressures and constraints. Less physical hardship, certainly, compared to peasant life, but a different kind of weight altogether, tied to family expectation, political obligation, and a level of formal structure that shaped basically every aspect of daily life from a genuinely young age. So when you put peasant and noble childhood side by side, it becomes pretty clear just how differently that same basic window of time, birth through age 10, could unfold, depending purely on the circumstances of birth, and regardless of which path a child found themselves on. Though, there was one thing that touched every single medieval childhood, wealthy or poor, and that's the genuine, constant threat of illness, which is exactly where we're headed next. Alright, we've touched on this a few times throughout the video already, but let's really sit with it here, because illness was honestly one of the defining, unavoidable realities of medieval childhood. regardless of whether a kid was born into wealth or poverty. Without modern medicine, without a real understanding of germs, and without much in the way of effective treatment, sickness posed a genuinely serious threat throughout basically every stage of childhood we've covered in this video. Let's start with just how common illness actually was. Kids today get sick plenty, obviously, colds, stomach bugs, that sort of thing. But we generally expect them to recover pretty reliably, thanks to modern medicine, proper nutrition, and a much better understanding of hygiene and disease prevention. In medieval times, though, illnesses that we'd consider fairly minor and manageable today carried genuinely serious risk, sometimes even fatal risk, especially for young children whose immune systems were already dealing with the nutritional challenges we discussed back in earlier chapters. Common childhood illnesses back then included things like various fevers, respiratory infections, which, remember, were made even more likely given all that smoke exposure we talked about way back in our fire chapter, plus a whole range of contagious diseases that could spread quickly through close-knit communities and households. Measles, for example, which most of us today think of as a fairly manageable childhood illness, thanks to vaccination and modern treatment, was actually a genuinely dangerous disease in medieval times, capable of causing serious complications or death, particularly among young children. So how did medieval families actually try to treat illness, given they had none of our modern medical tools or understanding? Well, this is where things get genuinely interesting, and honestly, a little bit wild by modern standards. Remember that whole humoral theory we discussed back in our chapter on hygiene? That same basic medical framework. The idea that health depended on balancing the body's four humors shaped how illness was understood and treated too, not just bathing habits. If a child got sick, treatment often involved trying to restore this supposed balance, sometimes through methods that honestly sound pretty rough to us today. Bloodletting, for instance, the practice of deliberately drawing blood from a patient, was a genuinely common treatment for various illnesses, based on this belief that it could help rebalance the body's humors. This was actually used on children too, which is a pretty striking detail when you think about how physically weakening this practice could be, especially for an already sick, already vulnerable young child. Herbal remedies were also widely used, and to be fair, some of these actually had genuine medicinal value, even if the underlying theory behind why they worked wasn't scientifically accurate by modern standards. Various plants and herbs were used to try to reduce fever, ease pain, or treat specific symptoms, and through generations of trial and error, some effective treatments genuinely did get discovered and passed down, even without a proper scientific understanding of why they actually worked. That said, plenty of other treatments were, to put it honestly, not effective at all, and sometimes actively harmful. Various charms, prayers, and superstitious practices were often used alongside, or sometimes instead of, more practical treatment, reflecting that same blend of practical knowledge and hopeful, faith-based tradition we've touched on throughout this whole video. When you don't understand what's actually causing an illness, it makes sense that people would turn to whatever combination of practical remedy and spiritual comfort felt like it might help. Quarantine and isolation, interestingly, did exist in some basic form, particularly during larger outbreaks of serious disease, since even without understanding germs specifically, people had generally observed that illness seemed to spread between people who were in close contact with each other, so there was some practical, observational wisdom at play here, even without the deeper scientific understanding we have today. For families, dealing with a sick child often meant relying on whoever in the community had the most practical medical knowledge, sometimes a local healer, sometimes an experienced older woman in the village, known for her knowledge of herbal remedies, sometimes, for wealthier families, an actual physician trained in the formal medical theories of the time. though even this formal training didn't necessarily mean significantly better outcomes compared to more informal community healers. It's honestly hard to overstate just how much uncertainty and fear must have accompanied childhood illness during this era. Without reliable treatment, without a real understanding of what was actually happening inside a sick child's body, families were often left simply hoping, praying, and trying whatever remedies were available, while genuinely not knowing whether a child would recover or not. This connects directly back to those infant and childhood mortality statistics we discussed earlier in the video too. Illness, more than almost anything else we've covered, was probably the single biggest factor contributing to why so many medieval children simply didn't survive to see their 10th birthday. It's a genuinely sobering thread running throughout this whole story of medieval childhood, this constant, underlying vulnerability to disease that touched every single family, regardless of wealth or social status. And illness, of course, connects pretty directly to something else we've mentioned throughout this video too: nutrition, and how what a medieval child actually ate played a genuinely significant role in their overall health, their growth, and honestly, their ability to survive these constant illness threats in the first place. Alright, so we've talked a lot throughout this video about hardship, about labor, about illness, but let's specifically zoom in now on something that connects to basically all of it: food. What medieval kids actually ate, and how that shaped their growth, their health, and honestly, their entire experience of childhood. Let's start with breastfeeding and weaning, since this picks up pretty naturally from our earlier chapter on infant care. Breast milk was, obviously, the primary food source for infants, and this generally continued for a genuinely long stretch compared to modern practice, sometimes up to 2 years, or even a bit longer in certain cases. This extended breastfeeding period actually served a pretty practical purpose, beyond just nutrition too, since it was believed, and there's actually some truth to this, to help space out pregnancies a bit, giving families a slightly longer gap between children. Once weaning did happen, a young child's diet would gradually shift toward whatever the rest of the family was eating, which, as we covered pretty extensively back in our breakfast chapter, generally meant a lot of bread, pottage, and whatever grains and vegetables happened to be available and affordable. This transition wasn't always smooth either, since weaning a child off breast milk and onto solid food during an era without any specialized baby food options meant kids were often eating pretty much the same dense, sometimes tough food as adults, just in smaller portions, often softened with liquid to make it a bit more manageable for smaller mouths and developing teeth. Here's where things get genuinely concerning from a modern nutritional perspective. Medieval diets, especially for peasant families, were often pretty limited in variety, heavily weighted toward grains and whatever vegetables could be grown and stored, with meat being a genuine luxury for a lot of families, especially reserved for special occasions rather than regular meals. This kind of limited dietary variety meant a lot of medieval children were likely dealing with various nutritional deficiencies, even in households that had, technically, enough food to avoid outright starvation. Vitamin deficiencies, in particular, were probably pretty widespread, though obviously nobody at the time understood this in the terms we would today. Limited access to certain fruits and vegetables, especially during winter months, when fresh produce simply wasn't available, likely contributed to various health issues that we can now specifically trace back to nutritional gaps, but which medieval people would have simply understood as general poor health or susceptibility to illness. This connects directly back to our previous chapter on sickness too. A child dealing with ongoing nutritional deficiency would naturally have a weaker immune system, making them even more vulnerable to the various illnesses we just discussed, creating this really difficult cycle where poor nutrition and disease susceptibility fed into each other, compounding the overall risk to a young child's health and survival. Seasonal variation played a huge role in childhood nutrition too, something worth emphasizing here, since it connects back to a lot of what we've covered throughout this whole video. Remember how we mentioned that late winter and early spring could be particularly lean times, right before new crops came in? This seasonal scarcity hit growing children especially hard, since their developing bodies needed consistent, adequate nutrition, and a period of reduced food availability during these vulnerable growth years could have genuinely lasting effects on their physical development. Height and overall physical stature actually give us some interesting historical evidence here too. Based on archaeological findings, examining skeletal remains from medieval populations, researchers have found evidence suggesting that chronic childhood malnutrition was reasonably common, sometimes visible in bone development patterns that indicate periods of growth interruption or nutritional stress during childhood years. This kind of evidence helps confirm what we've been discussing throughout this whole video in a pretty tangible, physical way. Class differences, once again, played a significant role in childhood nutrition too. Following that same pattern we've seen throughout this entire video, noble children generally had access to a much more varied, consistent diet, including regular meat consumption, a wider variety of foods, and less vulnerability to the kind of seasonal scarcity that affected peasant families so significantly. This nutritional advantage likely contributed to genuine differences in physical development and overall health between noble and peasant children, adding yet another layer to that broader divide in life experience we've discussed throughout this whole video. That said, it's worth acknowledging that even wealthy medieval diets weren't necessarily perfectly balanced by modern nutritional standards either, since the underlying scientific understanding of nutrition simply didn't exist yet for anyone, regardless of social class. Certain deficiencies could still occur, even within wealthier households, just generally to a lesser, less severe degree compared to what peasant children experienced. Water safety, something we covered pretty extensively earlier in this whole series, ties back into childhood nutrition here too. Remember how ale was often considered safer than plain water? This meant children, including quite young children, were sometimes given weak ale as a regular part of their diet, not for any recreational purpose, but genuinely as a safer hydration option compared to potentially contaminated water sources. When you put this whole picture together, limited dietary variety, seasonal scarcity, genuine nutritional deficiencies, and significant differences based purely on social class, it becomes pretty clear that food, or the lack of consistent, adequate food, played a genuinely significant role in shaping a medieval child's overall health, growth, and honestly, their odds of survival throughout this whole vulnerable stretch of childhood we've been exploring. And speaking of factors that shaped a medieval childhood pretty significantly, there's one more major piece we haven't fully covered yet, and it's not exactly a gentle topic either. How medieval society actually approached discipline, and what obedience and authority looked like within a medieval household. Alright, this next chapter deals with a topic that reflects some genuinely different attitudes compared to how we think about parenting and child rearing today. Discipline. And to understand medieval approaches to this, we really need to place it within the broader context we've been building throughout this whole video, one where obedience to authority, whether that's parental authority, religious authority, or social hierarchy in general, was considered a genuinely core value. Remember our chapter on religion and how heavily faith shaped moral instruction throughout medieval childhood? This connects directly to attitudes around discipline too. Religious teaching of the era generally emphasized the importance of obedience, both to religious authority and to parental authority within the household. Children were taught, from a genuinely young age, that respecting and obeying their parents wasn't just practical household management, it was considered a moral and spiritual obligation too. Physical discipline, what we'd today call corporal punishment, was a widely accepted, normalized part of child rearing throughout the medieval period. This wasn't seen as controversial or harsh by the standards of the time, the way it would be viewed by a lot of modern parenting philosophy. It was simply considered a normal, expected tool for teaching children appropriate behavior and maintaining household order, used across social classes, though obviously the specific circumstances and severity likely varied significantly between individual families. This attitude toward discipline connects back to that broader concept we discussed way back in Chapter 2. Remember, the age of reason, around age 7? Younger children, generally speaking, were given a bit more leniency and patience, since they weren't yet considered capable of fully understanding right from wrong. But once a child reached that more significant age of accountability, expectations around obedience and appropriate behavior increased pretty significantly, and with that came a greater likelihood of physical discipline for behavior considered unacceptable. It's worth noting here that this general attitude toward discipline wasn't unique to medieval Europe specifically. Similar approaches to child rearing, emphasizing obedience and using physical correction as a normal disciplinary tool, existed across a lot of different historical periods and cultures throughout human history. Modern attitudes toward gentler, non-physical discipline are actually a pretty recent development in the grand scope of history, which is worth keeping in mind as we look back at medieval practices without judging them purely through a modern lens. Religious institutions themselves often reinforce this general approach too. Remember how we talked about monasteries and church schools as one of the few paths to formal education? Discipline within these religious educational settings could be genuinely strict, reflecting that same broader belief that correction and even physical punishment served an important role in shaping moral character and ensuring proper behavior and respect for authority. That said, it would be inaccurate to paint medieval childhood purely as harsh and punitive, without any warmth or affection involved at all. Historical records, including personal letters and legal documents from the era, do show genuine evidence of parental love and affection too. Parents grieved deeply when children died, something we touched on back in our very first chapter. Families showed real care and concern for their children's well-being throughout the various challenges we've covered in this whole video. Discipline existed alongside genuine affection, not as a replacement for it, even if the specific methods of discipline look pretty different from what we'd consider appropriate today. Community and extended family also played a role in reinforcing behavioral expectations beyond just what happened within an individual household. Remember that loose, communal supervision network we discussed back in our toddler chapter? This extended into broader behavioral expectations too, with a real sense that children's behavior reflected not just on their immediate family, but on the broader household and community reputation as well. Gender, once again, played a role here too, connecting back to our earlier chapter on divergent paths for boys and girls. Expectations around obedience and appropriate behavior sometimes differed somewhat based on gender, with girls often facing particular emphasis on modesty and appropriate conduct, while boys faced their own specific expectations tied to developing strength, capability, and eventual readiness for their expected adult roles. It's honestly important to view this whole topic with a bit of historical context and nuance, rather than simply judging medieval discipline purely through a modern lens. These attitudes reflected the broader values, religious beliefs, and practical realities of an era genuinely different from our own, shaped by everything we've discussed throughout this whole video. The emphasis on survival, obedience to authority, and preparing children fairly quickly for the serious responsibilities of medieval adult life. And, after covering something this weighty, it feels like a good moment to shift towards something a little lighter again, because despite everything we've explored in this whole video, the hardship, the labor, the discipline, medieval childhood absolutely still had its moments of genuine joy and celebration too, which is exactly where we're headed as we start wrapping up this whole story. All right, after that heavier chapter, let's ease back into something warmer, because despite everything we've covered throughout this whole video, the hardship, the labor, the danger, the discipline, Medieval childhood genuinely did have real moments of joy too. Festivals, traditions, storytelling, little pockets of lightness that broke up the difficult daily grind we've spent this whole video exploring. Let's start with festivals and feast days, since these represented some of the biggest, most anticipated breaks from ordinary daily life. Remember back in our chapter on religion, when we mentioned that religious holidays provided some of the only real breaks from constant labor. These occasions were genuinely significant for kids specifically, representing rare stretches of time where the usual demanding routine, the fire tending, the water hauling, the field work, was set aside in favor of community celebration. Christmas, or the broader stretch of celebration around that time of year, was a genuinely major event throughout medieval Europe, involving special food, community gatherings, and various traditions that varied by region, but generally centered around this idea of warmth and togetherness during the darkest, coldest stretch of the year. For kids who'd spend most of their year dealing with cold, physically demanding daily routines, this kind of seasonal celebration must have felt genuinely special. Harvest festivals were another significant celebration, and these carry a nice bit of poetic connection to everything we've discussed throughout this whole video regarding agricultural labor. After a hard season of work in the fields, successfully bringing in a harvest was genuinely worth celebrating, and these festivals often involved music, dancing, and shared community meals, giving kids a chance to experience their village's collective effort and success in a genuinely joyful, celebratory way, rather than just through the lens of daily labor. May Day celebrations also deserve a mention here, generally involving outdoor festivities marking the arrival of warmer weather, often including things like dancing, flowers, and various seasonal traditions that varied quite a bit by specific region and local custom. For kids especially, this seasonal shift into warmer weather likely brought its own simple joy too. More opportunities for outdoor play, less time bundled up against harsh cold. That kind of basic, simple relief that comes with a change of season. Storytelling deserves a deeper mention here too, building on what we touched on earlier in this video. Those long winter evenings, when outdoor work and play weren't really possible, created natural opportunities for families to gather around the fire and share stories. This wasn't just educational, like we discussed back in our chapter on informal learning. It was genuinely entertaining too. Tales of local folklore, adventure stories, stories with a bit of humor or mystery woven in. These evening storytelling sessions probably represented some genuinely cherished, warm memories for a lot of medieval kids. A chance to just relax and enjoy imaginative entertainment within the comfort and safety of family. Music, too, played a role in these lighter, joyful moments. We mentioned simple instruments back in our toy chapter, but music extended well beyond just individual play into genuine community celebration too. Village gatherings, festivals, and even just casual evening entertainment often involve singing, simple instruments, and dancing, giving kids exposure to music and rhythm as a genuinely fun communal experience. Fairs and markets represent another interesting little pocket of joy worth mentioning here. Beyond their practical trading purpose, these gatherings often took on a bit of a festive atmosphere too, especially larger regional fairs that might include simple entertainment, food not typically available in everyday life, and just the general excitement of a change in routine and a chance to see people from outside the immediate village community. There's something worth acknowledging here too about the simple, everyday moments of joy that probably existed throughout medieval childhood, separate from these bigger, organized celebrations. Remember our chapter on play, all those games with hoops and knucklebones and simple outdoor activities? These daily moments of play, connecting with siblings and other village children, represented their own quiet, consistent source of joy, woven throughout even the most demanding, difficult stretches of daily medieval life. Family bonds themselves, despite the harsh disciplinary attitudes we just discussed in our last chapter, also represented a genuine source of warmth and connection for a lot of medieval children. Working alongside parents, learning skills through that close observation and imitation we've discussed throughout this whole video. These shared daily experiences, even when they involved genuine hardship and labor, likely created real bonds and a sense of belonging within the family unit. It's honestly a nice thing to sit with after everything else we've covered throughout this whole video. Despite the genuine hardship, the danger, the labor, the difficult odds of survival, medieval childhood wasn't purely bleak and joyless. Kids found real moments of connection, celebration, and simple fun, woven throughout even the most demanding stretches of daily life. That thread of human resilience and capacity for joy, even amid genuine hardship, feels like a pretty meaningful note to carry forward as we approach the final part of this whole story. Because eventually, every medieval child reached this specific threshold we've been building toward throughout this entire video, turning 10, and that milestone brought with it a whole new set of changes, marking a genuine, significant shift away from childhood and toward the responsibilities of medieval adult life. All right, so here we are, the end of this whole journey through medieval childhood, and we've finally reached that specific milestone we've been building toward throughout this entire video. Age 10. And, honestly, by the time a medieval child reached this point, they'd already been through so much of what we've covered: the fragile early years, the gradual increase in responsibility, the divergent paths based on gender and class. That turning 10 often felt less like a sudden dramatic shift, and more like the natural next step in a journey that had already been unfolding for years. Let's think back to where we started this whole video, that fragile, uncertain beginning, where simply surviving infancy was already a genuine achievement. By age 10, a child had made it through some of the most dangerous, vulnerable years of their entire life: the high-risk infant years, the hazardous toddler stage, the ongoing threat of childhood illness we discussed. All of that lay behind them now. In a very real sense, just reaching this age represented a genuine victory, something we probably take for granted today, but which was never guaranteed in medieval times. For peasant children, turning 10 generally meant an even further deepening of the responsibilities they'd already been gradually taking on for years. Remember our chapter on those little helper tasks that started before age 5? By age 10, a child had likely progressed well beyond simple chores into genuinely substantial contributions to household and agricultural labor, full participation in fieldwork, more complex household management tasks, real meaningful contribution to the family's overall survival and livelihood. For those kids who'd been sent off into apprenticeships, which we discussed often began right around this age, 10 might represent the early stages of that whole training journey: learning a trade, adapting to life within a new household, building toward eventual independent skill and capability that would define their entire adult working life. Noble children, following that different path we explored, would be deepening their own specific preparations to further education, more advanced training in courtly manners and expectations, and for boys specifically, potentially progressing further along that path toward eventual knighthood, if they were serving as a page within another noble household. Marriage negotiations, something we touched on in a few earlier chapters, sometimes became a more concrete reality around this age too, particularly for girls from noble families, where formal betrothals might already be arranged, even if actual marriage remained years away. This adds another layer to how differently this specific age was experienced, depending purely on the circumstances of a child's birth. It's worth reflecting here on just how compressed this whole journey was, compared to how we think about childhood and adolescence today. A modern 10-year-old is still very much considered a child, with years of relatively protected childhood and adolescence still ahead of them before real adult responsibility kicks in. A medieval 10-year-old, by comparison, was already well along a path toward genuine adult capability and responsibility, having spent years gradually building the skills, endurance, and knowledge they'd need for their expected adult role. This isn't to say childhood simply ended abruptly at exactly age 10, of course. The transition we've been tracing throughout this whole video was genuinely gradual, built up slowly through all those small helper tasks, the education, or lack of it, the physical training, the moral and religious instruction. Age 10 represented more of a meaningful continuation point within an already ongoing process, rather than some sudden, dramatic line between childhood and adulthood. Looking back over everything we've covered in this whole video, it's honestly remarkable just how much happened within these first 10 years of a medieval child's life. The fragile uncertainty of infancy, the blurry, evolving understanding of what childhood even meant, the early introduction to labor and responsibility, the stark divide between different social classes and genders, the constant underlying threat of illness and malnutrition. And yet, woven throughout all of that genuine hardship, real moments of play, connection, and joy too. It's a genuinely different world from what we know today, shaped by different priorities, different understanding, and honestly, a level of daily hardship that's hard for us to fully imagine now. But it's also, in its own way, a story of resilience, of families doing their best within genuinely difficult circumstances, of children adapting, learning, and growing within a world that offered very few guarantees, but that still, somehow, made room for small moments of warmth and joy along the way. So the next time you think about childhood, maybe your own, maybe your kids', it's worth taking a quiet moment to appreciate just how much has changed. The safety, the education, the simple luxury of an extended, protected childhood that so many of us get to experience today. It's a pretty recent development, historically speaking, and honestly, a genuinely precious one. Thank you so much for spending this quiet stretch of time with me, drifting through the world of medieval childhood. If this kind of gentle historical deep dive helps you unwind and ease into sleep, consider subscribing for more journeys like this one, and let me know in the comments what era or topic you'd like to explore next. Until then, sleep well,